the History of the World podcast, written and presented by Chris Hasler. Volume 3, The Classical World, Episode 63, Ancient Indian Religion. Any conversation about ancient Indian religion is normally based on the religious scriptures called the Vedas. The Vedas are religious texts thought to have been composed by Aryan migrants who arrived in the subcontinent after the mysterious disappearance of the Indus Valley civilization during the 2nd millennium BCE. The Vedas are the earliest known Sanskrit scriptures and the earliest texts that relate to the modern religion of Hinduism. There are 4 distinct Vedic scriptures: the Atharva Veda, the Samaveda, the Yajurveda, and the oldest of the 4, the Rig Veda. Before we go any further, it is very important to mention that this is not the first time we have tackled organised religion as a subject in this podcast. In Volume 1, we looked at the human rituals of the Paleolithic during Episode 13. This was the origin of our story of the earliest known human religion. During Volume 2, we developed on our knowledge of human ritual and the creation of deities or godly individuals that were honoured in a world full of polytheistic attitudes, which means the recognition of multiple gods or heroes. We explored religious development in and out of the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Greek-speaking lands to the north to the Egyptian-speaking lands to the south. We also explored how the earliest ancient scriptures gave us clues about how Near East religious attitudes developed into the much more familiar biblical scriptures and messages. Out of all the podcast episodes that have been turned into YouTube videos, the video about the emergence of biblical scriptures and ideas has been watched more than any other, and some of the feedback is not particularly positive. This is because some of those watching the video were looking to see if I would represent their religion in the way that they deemed to be correct. However, my presentation was a historian's unbiased view based on all the evidence to hand, with no preconceptions. So it didn't tell the story of the Bible, as some maybe hoped. So let me take this opportunity to say that this podcast episode is not an episode about Hinduism for devout Hindus or Buddhism for devout Buddhists. This is a study of all of the historical evidence without bias and how these religious concepts developed in society. As ever, you will make your own mind up about the chosen religions with all of my blessings. And that's my disclaimer out of the way. Firstly, let's identify the Hindu Trimurti. The first Hindu god of the Trimurti is Brahma, the god of creation. Traditionally, he created all life on earth. The second Hindu god of the Trimurti is Vishnu, the god of preservation. Traditionally, he controls and regulates the existence and flux of the universe. The third Hindu god of the Trimurti is Shiva, the god of destruction. Traditionally, he is going to destroy the universe before its recreation. However, this is also just one view of these 3 gods. One of many views that have come and gone over the course of modern history, and with each god experiencing varying degrees of importance. Shiva. So let's take a closer look at Shiva, the Hindu god of destruction. On the face of it, seemingly quite intimidating by being labelled as responsible for the destruction of the universe. but this is actually an inevitable action that Shiva will do in a considerate manner to guide the universe towards its rebirth. So Shiva's actions can be viewed as both bad and good. Some Hindus worship Shiva as the principal Hindu god, which differs from other Hindu observances. It is typical for all religions to have differing forms and doctrines though. The religious observance of Shiva as the principal deity of Hinduism is referred to as Shaivism. The history of Shiva is particularly fascinating though, and can cause us to look at Indian religion differently. Most of the Indian religions are initially traced back to the Vedas, which, as we mentioned at the start of the episode, are the oldest Sanskrit scriptures that discuss Hindu tradition and culture. The Sanskrit language is believed to have been brought to the Indian subcontinent via the Aryan migration, also known as the Indo-Iranian migration. This is because Sanskrit is an Indo-European language. We are also aware that there are two distinct branches of Indo-Iranians. The Iranians, who would compose the Avestan scripts that relate to Zoroastrianism, and the Indics, who would compose the Vedic scripts that relate to Hinduism. Before the arrival of the Indic peoples, we are aware that the Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappans, occupied this area. The Indus Valley civilization seemed to disappear before the arrival of the Indic peoples, and so therefore we could assume that they had no awareness of the Sanskrit and Vedic ideas that would follow them. If we go back to Volume 2, we devoted an entire episode to the Indus Valley civilization city of Mohenjo-Daro, which existed from around 2500 BCE to 1600 BCE. In that episode we described the discovery of an artefact called the Pashupati seal. The Pashupati seal depicts a figure that has too much in common with the artistic depictions of Shiva to be coincidental. There is a definite connection between the pre-Vedic Indus Valley civilization character and the post-Vedic characterization of the Hindu god Shiva. So the Vedas would have had an element of Indus Valley civilization cultural aspect to it, suggesting that some Hindu traditions predate the arrival of Indo-Europeans. We also supported this suggestion by referring to the great baths that the Indus Valley civilization constructed, being the precursor to the ritual Hindu bathing in the Ganges River. Brahma. When we look at world religions where we didn't have the kind of media that we do today, we can witness it altering and diversifying over time. This is why Ashoka the Great distributed inscriptions of edicts throughout the Mauryan Empire, because he wanted to standardise religious observance throughout his empire. In a similar way to how Hammurabi distributed his standardised law code throughout the Babylonian Empire. Egyptian kings such as Ramses II would use iconography to provide a code of thought throughout his Egyptian kingdom. When we look at Brahma, the Hindu Trimurti god, he has become somewhat of a forgotten icon in modern Hinduism, at least compared to Vishnu and Shiva. So even fundamental aspects of religions will change over time, and this will often be because the existence of an alternative perspective can cause chasms and schisms that can suit the ambitions of individuals and people who wish to change their own fortunes. Where both Vishnu and Shiva both spearheaded their own modern Hindu observances, Brahma does not. Brahma's importance as a Hindu deity has diminished over time. In some stories, Brahma's integrity as a personality has been ridiculed somewhat, whereas others just state that because he is the creator and he has done his creating, that now the important ones are Vishnu and Shiva, who will protect the present and the future. We must be careful to note that Brahmanism is not to Brahma what Shaivism is to Shiva, and indeed Vaishnavism is to Vishnu. Brahmanism is not the cult of Brahma. The easiest way to describe Brahmanism is the transition religion between the Vedic religion from the era of the Vedas and the modern religion of Hinduism. Brahmanism actually supported the structure of the caste system, which placed the Brahmin at the very top. We have spoken about this in recent episodes, but the Brahmin are the wise and academic priestly class of society placed at the very top of the caste system, even higher than the monarch himself. The four Varnas of the caste system, the Brahmin, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas and the Shudras, are said to have been created from different parts of Brahma's body. Siddhartha Gautama. The significance of Siddhartha Gautama is that he was a prince who became the Buddha, and therefore the founder of Buddhism. However, Siddhartha Gautama was born into a royal family within the Indian subcontinent, which predominantly observed Brahmanism. Siddhartha Gautama would ponder on the aspect of Vedic faiths that humans continually reincarnate until they have been enlightened. Siddhartha Gautama observed the suffering of humankind going on around him and looked for a way to make sense of it. He would take great amounts of religious advice and engage in meditation to discover the truth. He would turn his back on his affluent royal upbringing, and although he opted against the suffering of total poverty, he would practice self-denial to an extent. There were already monks living in total self-denial in their quest for enlightenment, and Siddhartha Gautama practiced such asceticism before concluding that this was not the answer. Siddhartha Gautama would teach a different way where his students were encouraged to live a life without desire in order to attain the enlightenment required to break the cycle of reincarnation. Later in his own life, Siddhartha Gautama would legendarily sit under the Bodhi Tree and attain his own level of enlightenment, and from then on he would be known as the Buddha. The Bodhi Tree is a sacred fig tree located in the modern Indian state of Bihar, and the site is now known as Bodh Gaya. An iconic statue of the Buddha reaching almost 20 metres in height exists at this sacred Buddhist site now, with many monasteries. The Buddha's teachings are represented by a wheel, which can still be found at the centre of the Indian national flag to this day. So here we see the historical divergence of what we know today as Buddhism from what would become Hinduism. But we must be very careful when trying to categorically state any information relating to the ancient differences and aspects. Buddhists are often said to follow the Shramanic traditions, which include non-violence towards humans and animals, and asceticism, or a life of austerity, in a quest to achieve moksha, which is the breaking of samsara, the process of being reborn after each of your deaths. However, we must be quick to state that Hindus also pursue moksha, even though they are Vedic and not Shramanic. However, some commentators state that Shramanic traditions predate the life of the Buddha and even find their roots in Vedic scripts. So the traditional lines between Hinduism and Buddhism are blurry, according to which commentators you choose to believe. Ashoka the Great. Ashoka got an entire episode to himself back in episode 60, because he has become such an icon of the ancient Indian world and a major Buddhist icon in a country that generally tried to downplay Buddhism and Ashoka in favour of Hinduism, to the point where he was just another name on a king list. When Ashoka's scriptures were deciphered during the 19th century, his identity and importance were brought back into historical significance. Ashoka the Great was a Mauryan emperor who turned his back on the otherwise normal warrior monarchy, where imperial reach was extended by fighting and killing one's enemies. He would follow the Shramanic path of non-violence set out by the Buddha and become the Buddha's biggest advocate. Ashoka would develop a temple site with a shrine at the site of the Buddha's Bodhi Tree and use a cutting from the tree to plant a new tree to represent the Buddha's tree. Ashoka would build stupas around the Maurya Empire, which are burial monuments. The remains of the Buddha were distributed to the various stupas to give them significance and an important presence among the predominantly Brahmanic population. There is an irony to Ashoka's success in spreading the word of Buddhism, which extended its influence to East and Southeast Asia. The opportunity for Buddhism to reach other areas of Asia was enhanced by the fact that Ashoka, Buddha's greatest advocate, violently conquered other lands, slaughtering the populations. Due to his successful terrorization of other cultures, peaceful Buddhism was able to attain a wider reach when Ashoka distributed his remorseful edicts throughout his conquered empire. Ashoka's representation of the Buddha's teachings in terms of a moral code of conduct of self-improvement can be referred to as the Buddhist Dhamma, loosely developed from the Vedic tradition of Dharma, which also became a Hindu tradition. Pushyamitra Shunga. Now, in the previous episode, we introduced the story of the aftermath of the Maurya Empire, which gave way to the Shunga dynasty, who ruled from the heartlands of the Magadha kingdom, which contained the powerful city of Pataliputra, identified as close to the location of the modern city of Patna, which is about 60 miles north of the Mahabodhi temple, the location of the Bodhi Tree that was enhanced during the reign of Ashoka the Great. As we previously mentioned, despite all of this positive promotion of Buddhism, it was still a minority religion of India. Brahmanism and Hinduism, if we dare to consider them to be synonymous during this period, was the most popular religion. When Pushyamitra Shunga assassinated the last Maurya monarch and took control of the lands of the Magadha kingdom, it was clear that Pushyamitra had no regard for Buddhist tradition. One of the indicators of Pushyamitra's spiritual beliefs was his continuous acts of Ashvamedha, a traditional act of horse sacrifice that legitimizes a monarch's right to rule, and is traceable back to the early Vedic religion. This practice would not have been in any way compatible with Buddhist Dhamma. However, beyond this, Pushyamitra is reported to have persecuted Buddhist monks in a show of religious intolerance, which wasn't necessarily common in Indian lands. He would even take an iconoclastic attitude to Buddhist temples and stupas by attempting to destroy a number of them during his reign. Pushyamitra was the first monarch of the Shunga dynasty. Even though he was intolerant of Buddhism, this was not an aspect of the Shunga dynasty, but something very personal to Pushyamitra. Buddhism continued to flourish during the Shunga dynasty despite the fact that Brahmanism was clearly the more dominant and powerful movement. Buddhist schisms. After the lifetime of the Buddha, the purity of Buddhism was challenged at various points during its earliest centuries. Buddhism was not unlike Christianity in that it was a minority religion in its early years with a lot of missionary activity. There were Buddhist monks accepting financial gifts, and there were a reports of significant councils being called in order to try to standardise Buddhism, yet another thing that we saw in Christianity's early years within the Roman Empire. Emperor Ashoka the Great sponsored one of these Buddhist councils during his lifetime, and it took place in Pataliputra. This is referred to historically as the Third Buddhist Council. We're not really sure whether this is considered to be a Buddhist council for all Buddhists, or whether the fractures in Buddhism had already become too wide for any council to consider this to be repairable. The biggest schism of Buddhism is the schism between Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. Some state that Ashoka's Third Buddhist Council was set up to repair this emerging schism, but others say that the schism was already so wide that the Third Buddhist Council was specifically a Theravada Buddhist council, and that Mahayana Buddhism was a disparate movement by this time. Theravada Buddhism would flourish in Sri Lanka thanks in part to the work of Ashoka's children, who continued to promote Buddhism on their father's behalf. It was in Sri Lanka at the Fourth Buddhist Council that the Pali Canon was recorded in writing in around the year 83 BCE. The Pali Canon, also called the Pali Tipitaka, was an oral tradition before this and can be traced back to the Third Council organised by Ashoka, and then stretching back to the oral instruction of the Buddha himself. It is said that these oral traditions had to be written due to the fact that many of the Sri Lankan monks had been starving to death due to drought, and there was a genuine fear of the oral traditions being lost. The Pali Canon to this day are a set of significant Buddhist scriptures named the Pali Canon due to it being recorded in the Pali language of the Indian subcontinent. Now, to those of you who have been listening to the podcast episodes chronologically, you may have noticed that this is not the first time that I have mentioned the Fourth Buddhist Council. During the episode about the Kushan Empire, which was episode 61, we mentioned that the Kushan Emperor Kanishka instigated the Fourth Buddhist Council in the lands of Kashmir, which doesn't connect to what we have said in this episode about the Fourth Buddhist Council taking place in Sri Lanka during the 1st century BCE. The reason for this difference is because Kanishka's council was a Sarvastivada Buddhist council, which is linked to the Mahayana Buddhist division, which does not recognise the Theravada Fourth Buddhist Council held in Sri Lanka or the Pali Tipitaka. So Buddhism had clearly and distinctly diversified by this time, with Kanishka's Buddhists preferring to study the Mahayana Sutras. Hindu scriptures. Sutras is actually a very wide description of written religious advice that is used for all of the Vedic faiths of the Indian subcontinent. So there are Hindu sutras and Jainist sutras, as well as Buddhist sutras. Many of the Buddhist sutras are recordings of the teachings of the Buddha himself, but the earliest Brahmanic or Hindu sutras find their place in the Vedas themselves. It may have been during the era of the Gupta Empire of the Indian subcontinent that it was decided that Hinduism needed an all-encompassing set of religious texts that would record all of their mythologies and traditions, and so the Puranas were created. Despite the Gupta Empire generally having a reputation for religious tolerance, a motivation for the construction of the Puranas was to standardise Hinduism and bring discipline to its practices, which in turn would bring clarity to Hindu society and the caste system. The Ramayana was written by the poet Valmiki, and it is a poem about the incarnation of the Hindu god of the preservation of the current universe, Vishnu. The incarnation's name is Rama, but we're not completely sure when Valmiki lived and penned this poem. I've seen dates offered between the 7th century BCE and the 2nd century CE, so there is no firm consensus. The epic poem centres around Rama's attempts to rescue his wife, who was kidnapped by the demon king, Ravana, and it is a mythological story with moral messages for the Hindu community. Another associated Hindu text is the Mahabharata, which we can attribute to the Gupta period. It is one of the most important religious texts in history. The text is written by Vyasa, a figure who is considered to be an immortal in Hindu tradition. The story within the text explores the relationship between the two branches of the royal Bharata dynasty and their war with each other. The most popular section being the discourse between Arjuna and his charioteer Krishna. Arjuna reaches the battlefield and has a crisis of conscience when he sees the war taking place between these royal blood relations. His charioteer Krishna is actually once again an incarnation of the Hindu god Vishnu. The discourse provides much in the way of general moral guidance for the Hindu community as a whole, which is why the text is treasured. When talking of the Gupta dynasty, once again we are talking of a predominantly Hindu empire in Indian lands. If we look back to episode 62 on the Gupta Empire though, then we can see reference to what we believe to be the originator of the dynasty, a king called Gupta, building a Buddhist pilgrimage in Indian lands. So this suggests religious tolerance, or indeed that Gupta himself was a practicing Buddhist. His grandson, Chandragupta I, married into the Lichavi kingdom. The Lichavi are portrayed as Buddhists, but there is no evidence of Chandragupta himself being a Buddhist. His son Samudragupta was evidently a Brahmanist or an observer of Hindu gods. However, he asked a Buddhist priest to teach his son, and allowed the Sri Lankan king to build his own Buddhist monastery near Bodhi Tree. So once again, a great demonstration of the existence of religious tolerance. In retrospect, the religious position of the Gupta Empire appears to be one of Hinduism with a leaning towards Vaishnavism, with an absence of encouraged persecution of the heterodox religions such as Buddhism and Jainism. Proliferation. During this brief series of podcast episodes on ancient India, which is now drawing to a close, we have been somewhat negligent of the far south of the Indian subcontinent, which is the modern Indian state of Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu always stayed somewhat distinct from the great empires of the north, and it is one of those areas where Jainism flourished more so than in other areas of India. The Jainists, as far as world religion goes, are closely linked to the Buddhists in that both faiths suggest an ascetic existence being a correct way to respect life on earth, with non-violence, vegetarianism and avoidance of material attachment being seen as good things. Both do not recognise gods, but do believe in deification where an individual can be considered as divine. You can find Buddhist priests, but not so much in Jainism where a priestly class is not recognised, in favour of humble monks and nuns instead. A contemporary of the Buddha called Mahavira is important to Jainists in that he was responsible for standardising Jainism and defining what it meant to be a Jainist for the comprehension of its followers. Jainists are looking for the route to moksha, which as we know is the enlightenment which allows us to escape our constant rebirth. The quest for moksha is something that links Jainism to Buddhism and Hinduism, and indeed the more modern religion of Sikhism. Jainism can be discovered in various areas of India and was comparatively successful in the western states of Rajasthan and Gujarat, as well as taking advantage of the cultural difference of Tamil Nadu, where Brahmanism was not so dominant in ancient times. Theravada Buddhism found its success spreading away from Hindu lands, such as in Sri Lanka, where it was distinctly recognised as the Theravada branch, in contrast to its spread in the opposite directions to the lands of the Kushans, where we can recognise it as the Mahayana branch. Mahayana Buddhism would travel eastwards along the Silk Roads, where it would find popularity during the first millennium in the lands of China, Korea and Japan. The religious tolerance shown by the Hindu faith in Indian lands meant that those who felt an affiliation to some Buddhist traditions were able to integrate into Hindu culture without persecution, which actually meant that Buddhism was probably just naturally consumed into Indian religious practices rather than conquered or outlawed. The Theravada Buddhist practice would migrate from Sri Lanka across the Bay of Bengal, where it would become an important part of the culture of Southeast Asia, such as in Myanmar, Thailand, Laos and Cambodia, an area that we will concentrate some attention to during Volume 4. Some would argue that the presence of Shiva in Indus Valley Civilization artwork points towards Hinduism being the oldest attested modern religion in the world. But this is open for strong debate, especially by fundamentalists who would dismiss a mainstream overview based purely on archaeology and scientific dating. It is also open to criticism by those who interpret ancient scriptures as being relative to particular aspects of modern religions, such as the flood myths of ancient Mesopotamian texts being comparable to the flood myth in the Old Testament, for example. Hinduism also travelled to Southeast Asia, which is not often referenced due to the great presence of Buddhism and Islam there. Hinduism did successfully travel to Malaysia and Vietnam, which are the areas of Southeast Asia not as closely associated with Buddhism as the other areas already mentioned. In the modern world, around 80% of modern Indians in India identify as Hindus. Incredibly, less than 1% of modern Indians in India identify as Buddhists. Of the 20% of Indians who do not identify as Hindus, around 3/4 of them identify as Muslim. Muslims are considered to be monotheistic and Abrahamic, which is in complete contrast to the Vedic faiths of India that dominate South and East Asia to this day. The Muslim religion of Islam spread to India from its roots in Arabia and the Near East, so it is geographically, culturally and characteristically more closely linked to Judaism and Christianity. So next week we will explore the ancient story of these three Abrahamic religions, which alongside Hinduism and Buddhism make up the 5 major religions of the modern world, in a bid to cover the topic of modern religion in the ancient world fully. There you go. Hope you enjoyed that one. A bit of an insight into the emergence of Buddhism and Hinduism in India predominantly, and hopefully a bit of an insight into how Buddhism isn't really present in India as we might expect to see it, and apart from the traditional Buddhist monasteries really, and very small population of India now Buddhist. As we go forward through the volumes, we'll probably explore more about Buddhism in other areas of the world. So we'll be certainly coming back to that at some point. But I think these are fundamental subjects in order to explain fully the cultures of these countries, especially back sort of 1,000 to 2,000 years ago. And those of you who've listened to this podcast, and I'm all too aware that I will have a lack of direct feeling and expertise with such subjects. Being, I'm not a Hindu. I'm certainly not from India. And so there may be people listening to this podcast thinking, well, I'm not sure that Chris is completely capturing the feeling that I believe someone should be if they're explaining a history of Hinduism. And so I apologise. And look, if you're interested in helping me to understand it better, please do write in. I'd love to hear from you, even if it's positive, negative. I'm really just very, very interested in hearing what you've thought of the work that I've put into this particular podcast episode. So looking forward to hearing from you and getting your impression as to how you felt about the podcast this week. Now, if you're enjoying the podcast and you want to help to keep it going, then you can support the podcast. You can rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to it. That always helps to expand the reach of the podcast. And then if you want to do a little bit more, you can actually make a financial contribution to the podcast. And with each financial contribution, I can dedicate more time and resources to the podcast itself, to the whole project itself. So always grateful for any financial contributions. There are rewards that you can gain, gifts and privileges that can be gained. Just go along to the Patreon website, which you can find through the historyoftheworldpodcast.com website. Just click on the Patreon link and have a little click around, explore, and if you want to sign up, by all means do so. When you sign up, if any of you have ever made a financial contribution of any sort to the podcast, whether it be $1 or $200, you will become recognised as a member of the History of the World podcast Illuminati. And this week we welcome in Yakim Pence and Josh Woods, both now members of the History of the World podcast Illuminati. We did get a suggestion from Lynn Dowling, who's already a member of the Illuminati. He's put, Chris, I'm already a patron, but also wanted to suggest a book, To a Mountain in Tibet by English travel writer Colin Thubron. He travels to the solitary peak of Kailash. To Buddhists and Hindus, it is the mystic heart of the world and an ancient site of pilgrimage. It has never been climbed. It is likely sacred because the area is the source of the Indus, Ganges, Brahmaputra and Sutlej rivers. Not necessarily a scholarly tome, but a great read, and I learned a lot. If you can make the time, it sure fits with the current podcast subject matter. Cheers, Lynn from San Diego. Certainly, yes. I think that's one that's worth sharing with everyone, Lynn. I think that was definitely worth reading out to the entire community. If you've enjoyed this week's subject matter, then maybe that is a book for you to consider. Let's have a look at some of the messages that have been sent in this week. Let's see who's written in. We've got a message that's coming from Thomas Watson, and I might need to just paraphrase a little bit of this actually, because it's rather long, so I might not be able to read the whole thing out. But it just says, YouTube has suggested a couple of your podcasts to me over recent weeks, and I've enjoyed them, but I thought I'd add a thought after watching the Pictish history video. You expressed a view which is the popular and traditional one, that the Anglo-Saxon migration occurred after the end of the Roman period and that it effectively dislodged native Britons to what we now see as Celtic regions. And then he's suggesting that there is work to say that this is unlikely. This is actually an unlikely thing. It says that the works of Francis Pryor state that the Anglo-Saxons were already in Britain before the Romans. And it says the detail in the Oppenheimer book is excellent, goes from the genetic to linguistic to the historic and makes a compelling case for a very different history of Britain. One tiny point he makes is to speak to the point where is regarding the Saxon shore forts, simply that their name would be the first time in history that a geographical feature, the Saxon shore, was named after the people attacking it rather than the people inhabiting it. Yeah, I've often thought that myself, actually, if I'm honest. Like it seems like a strange thing to put. And also, like, the Franks were reported to be raiding the coasts of Britain in a similar period during that sort of 3rd and 4th century. It's an interesting point of view. I often think to myself, and I think, like, I tend to always reply if anyone writes in, I'll give you the long-winded answer. But, like, in short, I don't always understand why there's opposition views. To be honest with you, a lot of the time, history, the Celtic relationship with Europe and etc. is founded on evidence, and evidence that's certainly from written history, from the Romans' written history. Now, it might not be exactly as mainstream history portrays it, but certainly there's going to be some veracity in it. And I'm not saying that the theory of Germanic speakers settling Britain before the exit of the Romans in 410. I'm not saying that's not possible. It certainly is possible, but I'm not in this school of thought of it's one theory or the other. I can't see why it wouldn't be an amalgamation of the two theories. Why couldn't both of them be true, or true to an extent? So, and I think that about the Celtic Atlantic seaboard theory as well. I think that, obviously Latin is very, very relevant in terms of its cultural aspects, in terms of that link, so that it has to have something to do with the story. So why wouldn't Latin have been influenced by Atlantic seaboard cultures of Gaul? Why would that not be a possibility? It's certainly not that far inland from the west coast, Latin. So anyway, but I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting to debate, and none of us really know the real answer. So, but I often think, there can be elements of two different theories, or even more, and I can't see why that's never the case. For me, it's rarely a case of one theory versus another, 100% versus 100%. But an interesting email, Tom, and give me an opportunity to ramble on for a couple of minutes. And then we got a message from Ian Stone, who's put, I have the impression of someone who does not know what they are doing is beyond human ability, and so goes about it anyway. What are you going to do today? Continue creating my history of the world? That's nice, dear. Like a person who, upon seeing bicyclists, is that a word, bicyclists? I'm calling cyclists, but it surely is a word, bicyclists. It's just probably one that I don't use. Who, upon seeing bicyclists, fails to realise the need to pedal, and so sits upright in the seat, motionless, in perfect balance. I have found your work. I can't even believe it is really there. I will listen to all of it. Thank you for this completely impossible feat of creation. That's from Ian Stone. Well, that's very humbling indeed to read something like that. I mean, if you love something, you're going to do it, aren't you? And I think, to be honest with you, I've collected quite a lot of literature over the years, and it really is just a case of respecting the literature that you've bought, and as long as you've bought the right literature, you should be able to find enough material to make a comprehensive podcast. And let's say, for example, I'll give you an example. We've been talking about the Celts. If we look at, I made an episode about the Celtic cultures. I can't remember which number it was numerically, but it was certainly like a couple of months ago now. But if you listen to someone like Kevin Stroud of the History of English podcast, he does a podcast about Celtic cultures, and it's totally different. I love his style, and I love his presentation style, and I love the depth of his research, and I'm almost envious of it. So if someone thinks that my work is good, there's me thinking that someone else's work is better, and there'll be someone who podcasts that looks at my work and probably thinks, well, I wish my work was more like that. But to be honest, the uniqueness of the podcast, you don't want to hear podcasters telling the same story in the same style wherever you go. So, my podcast about the Celts, the point that I'm making is my story is not the be all and end all. You can listen to someone else's podcast and you can gain more knowledge, you can gain more perspective because it's someone else's story. And that's all we're doing. We're telling our own story based on the interpretation of the information that we've discovered. So, not as impossible as maybe it might seem. Right, always one of my favourite times of the week is when I get to read out the reviews. Certainly, most of them come from Apple Podcasts. So you're all a bunch of nutters, and I love you to bits. An absolute bunch of lunatics. Let's read them out. Let's see what we've got this week. We've got Infamous IA from the United States of America, but hands down best history podcast. I am not sure exactly what it is that makes this show so great. It may be the host's voice, then it very well may be the information bestowed, but I hear you saying it's the script writing, which none of these are wrong, and when put together the results are magical. Thank you for helping my work days not be intolerably boring. Keep up the good work. Well, I'm glad that I'm managing to keep you entertained. Peony11111 from the United States of America has put great, awesome, and that's it. Very brief, and can't argue with that at all. Thank you so much. A nice 5-star review. That really does help the podcast. Honestly, if you just put a 5-star rating in, I can't thank you enough. It just really helps the project. Blind Hoops from Great Britain has put simply wonderful. This is the book I've always wanted to find, but in podcast format. I've always found engaging with history a struggle, but this I'm hooked. Brilliantly researched, and Chris delivers it in a way that draws you in. So enjoyable. Can't recommend it enough. Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much, Blind Hoops. And Basia Fabian has put best history podcast. She's from the United States of America, but I love this podcast so much. It's the only history podcast that's chronological and thorough. Chris's voice and tone is engaging, yet calming, and he knows his stuff. He makes everything so interesting, and it's authentic and genuine, not overly produced like other shows where some voice actor is just reading a script. And I love it at the end when he reads his fan mail. Both good and bad. He's so sweet, I want to invite him for dinner. You haven't seen what my table manners are like, so just be careful what you wish for there. But look, a wonderful review, very kind and very sweet, and yourself. Thank you very much, and thanks to everybody who's written in and put a little note on. Wherever you've done it, it's wonderful. And don't forget, once the podcast ends, that's not the end of it. It's you can go to the website, the historyoftheworldpodcast.com website, and you can go to the interact section and get involved there. We've got the Facebook page, we've got the Facebook fan group. Don't forget that, by Jenna Osborne. We get a bit out of character. It's like the out of character board there, so we can discuss anything really on the History of the World fan group. So be sure to sign up for that on Facebook. If you want the details, let me know if you're struggling to find it. You can follow me on Twitter, of course. You can also come to the discussion forum. We can discuss things in depth there. So like once the podcast ends, there's a lot of people signed up to the podcast to the discussion forum, so you can venture into any topic you want, and I'm sure you'll get a response from somebody, and I always try to respond to everybody, myself anyway, so come along, and if you've got questions, it can be about anything. It can be absolutely anything. We don't even have to have covered it yet, you know. You can ask me, you know, how I go about picking what pair of socks to wear in the morning. I don't think anything's off limits, really. And you know, just come and join in. Come and enjoy the fun. And you know, we're all stuck indoors at the moment. I think most of us, thanks to the pandemic, we're all sort of stuck at home. So let's find ways to keep ourselves entertained. Let's try and find a healthy way to communicate and you know, interact, and let's do something together. You know, let's try and get through all this together and have a bit of fun along the way. Anyway, that's plenty from me. Next week, we're still going to be looking at the subject of religion. So we're just going to tie up those loose ends. So we've explored out of the 5 main religions of the world, the 5 main religions that we recognise today. We've explored the emergence of 2 of them. I want to explore the emergence of the other 3, the 3 Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam. So we're going to do that next week. So we're going to hopefully have, you know, covered the whole topic of religion in a good and comprehensive fashion over the course of this week and next week. So thank you so much for joining us this week, and we'll do it all over again next week. And until next week, obviously, don't forget to be good. Come to the History of the World podcast.com and join all the other hot worlders on our wide range of social media. Why not support the podcast by clicking the Patreon link or buying me a book and becoming a lifelong member of the History of the World podcast Illuminati? Drop me a line at historyoftheworldpodcast@mail.com and let me know what you thought of this week's episode. See you next time.